Thank you so much, Isha. Obviously, the impacts of sea level rise, very important topic. We also, think about situation we live in where we have weather and variability from time to time. So we think of sea level rise, but also, think 10, 20 years from now, even with a little bit of sea level rise, what a modest or a strong storm could mean in terms of impact. So just another risk that can seem far off, but when you superpose that risk with natural variability and weather, it's not that far off, and making meaningful impacts, not just here already, but also in the developing world and places that are much more vulnerable. Our next presentation, also staying on this theme of marine systems, but this time we get to talk about charismatic macrofauna. Our next presentation is Jaden Hill, Climate Change Impacts on the Eastern Pacific Green Sea Turtles and Policy Implications. So Jaden, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. My name is Jaden Hill, and I will be talking about the climate change impacts on Eastern Pacific green sea turtles and their policy implications, specifically in San Diego Bay. So nice. Awesome. And so for my presentation today, first I'm going to start off with what motivated this project, how did I get here, what was my problem statement I looked at, and some research gaps as well. Next, I'm going to give some background on what fieldwork I did, what my project goals were as I explored these things. Next, I'm kind of going to look to get how do all of these things fit together on local, regional, state scales. And finally, I'm going to give some policy recommendations, some adaptation options, and what is next. I'd like to start off by thanking some of my committee members and collaborators. Corey was on my capstone committee, as well as Dr. Jeffrey Semenoff at NOAA. He was my capstone chair, and he was very helpful in helping me create this project and doing the research. And I'd also like to thank Mary Barabee and Tracy Tempest. They were two wonderful women that live in San Diego Bay that were really helpful throughout this project process. Awesome. So, motivation for this project. I kind of came to this, I was originally interested in green sea turtles in San Diego Bay, but as I started to dig into this, I realized that there's this lacking understanding regarding the interconnectedness of how climate change, conservation, ecosystem services, and the value of environmental policy fit together. This information is out there, but there seems to be a disconnect between the information availability and its ability to inform voting decisions. And so if we can say the information is out there and we recognize this problem, why do we see this general public apathy surrounding climate change and conservation? And so is this an issue in our communication of that information? Are there shortcomings in educational and science communication efforts? Or is the public access to this information just not there, not accessible? And so I kind of wanted to look at these specific research gaps to start off my project. And so in terms of public awareness, 77% of Americans have heard about these environmental issues, but only 53% of them would say that these are worth the cost that we see in our federal taxes. And so going off that, 67% of Americans agree that the federal government is not doing enough to reduce the effects of climate change. And so then we see this gap of if the people can hear about these things and they agree that the government's not doing enough, why do we not see these reflections in our voting patterns and consumer choices, specifically in the context of conservation? And so when taking on this project, I was originally most interested, as I said, in sea turtles in San Diego Bay, and I'm looking to pursue a career in marine conservation. But as I started this program, I really became interested in this relationship between policy and science. How do all of these things fit together? And as I continue to dig into it, what are the implications for this, not only in San Diego, but also on a state level, on a federal level, and also on an international level? Sea turtles are really special because they nest one place and forage in different places, and so they do have to work together on an international scale. And so in order to explore these things, I did a literature review, and I got to conduct some field work as well, which was awesome. And so for my field work, I started off, I had the opportunity to participate with my advisor and with the NOAA Marine Turtle Research Team with some other US Navy scientists, NGO representatives, and students interested in sea turtle science and conservation. And so following our introductions, the research team set up, we met at a specific location in South San Diego Bay, and the NOAA team went out and caught these sea turtles, brought them back, and then we got to do measurements, tissue sampling, and the attachment of telemetry devices, which you see right here as well. I actually got to install that telemetry device. We weighed these turtles, ranging from 50-something pounds to 300 pounds, which was also really cool. And after we safely transported them to shore, the team allowed students and volunteers to assist with all these things. And I'm beyond grateful for the opportunity that I had to participate in this kind of hands-on research. And I also found that opening this fieldwork to people that are interested is really effective in garnering support for turtle conservation efforts, even within organizations that are already in conservation. For example, with this, we had people like San Diego Coastkeepers, but we had lawyers from San Diego Coastkeepers who had no experience with conservation work. So here is an image of me securing this telemetry tag. These are really cool. They allow NOAA, they track the turtles' movements from foraging areas to nesting beaches, and then that information is sent back to NOAA, which assists in their research as well. And here are some images of different shell measurements. You can see on the top, they're taking the width and then the length on the bottom. So a little bit more background on foraging versus nesting locations. This is a map that shows the foraging location around. So you have, these are kind of your population distribution. So up here we have Southern California, Mexico, all the way down. And that is where we see most of these Eastern Pacific green sea turtles. This is a map of San Diego Bay, where it is in relation to the greater San Diego area. And so on the southern end of the bay is where this fieldwork was conducted. And this is an example of the data I just talked about from those telemetry tags. You can see sea turtles actually going all the way from San Diego Bay down to their nesting beaches and back, which is really cool. So what kind of services do sea turtles provide to us? For starters, they are really important in something called short-circuiting the detritus cycle. And so the detritus cycle refers to this nutrient cycling that we see in the ocean and in marine ecosystems. Sea turtles are responsible for pruning seagrass in the bay. When they eat that seagrass, digest it, and then poop it back out, it circulates nutrients on a much faster timescale than it would if that seagrass were to naturally grow and decompose. And so this is really important for the health of seagrass, also for different marine ecosystems, which further bolsters our fishing economy in the bay. Again, seagrass pruning and maintenance, water quality, also an essential seagrass function. And then they do something called marine nutrient subsidies. So when turtles consume the seagrass and nutrients, they then forage in San Diego Bay, they then go nest in beaches in Mexico, and they lay those eggs. And not all those eggs hatch. And so some of those eggs are then become a part of the terrestrial ecosystems. There are some birds and local predators that feed on those eggs. And then we have this transfer of nutrients from ocean ecosystems to terrestrial ecosystems, which is really important. What kind of threats are they facing? Climate change is currently the biggest one. As we see these warming waters and sand, we're seeing changes in migratory patterns and erosion on beaches, which is really detrimental to their nesting habits, as well as sea level rise. I will get into it a little bit later, but feminization trends are also a really big threat to sea turtle populations associated with climate change. And then on a more practical level, we also see boat strikes in San Diego Bay, which is like the image that I have up here, and something called chlorpa, which is a toxic algae. It's an invasive species, and we do see some of that in the bay as well. So what regulatory agencies are responsible for sea turtle management? On a local level, the city and county governments and working with the Port of San Diego are responsible for ensuring that sea turtle habitat is protected and safe. San Diego Coastkeeper also works in conjunction with the Zoo and Wildlife Alliance, and then the Coast Guard is also responsible for some of that in enforcing wake zones and all of those things. On a state level, we see the state version of Fish and Wildlife, the Ocean Protection Council, NOAA, state level offices, and then California has something called the Marine Life Protection Act, which is really important for conservation efforts, as well as we have our own Endangered Species Act on top of the federal Endangered Species Act. And at a national level, national branch of Fish and Wildlife, as well as NOAA, the Coast Guard, and the Endangered Species Act are largely what protects our turtles. So how do all these things fit together? Our ability to understand how a species functions in its environment, how it interacts with other species, and how it operates biologically allows us to better understand the importance of protecting that species. Additionally, when we can concretely determine the patterns and behaviors of a given species, we can better identify the threats that they might face as a result of human action. And so it requires research over extended periods of time to better understand the threats a species faces, and the prevalence of these threats also functions to inform conservationists. This in turn allows people and organizations to create plans that best mitigate harm to that particular species, which in this case is sea turtles. So when we establish the services that a species provides to both their ecosystem and to our lives, we have concrete motivation for developing and delegating responsibility to these regulatory agencies to carry out their conservation plans for protection. So kind of outline, what do these things look like on a local level? So my original point of interest here was to look at how are green sea turtles important in our local ecosystem. And so between these two things, on a second level, they're essential in, I'd say, seagrass health is the biggest thing here, which is also important for ecosystem health, and just generally, we see water quality issues as well. So all of these things are a little bit interconnected. And on a third level, we see these, in addition to water quality, we have issues with coastal runoff and heavy metals and organic pollutants. All of those things are kind of mitigated by having healthy seagrass. And as I mentioned previously, seagrass health is really essential in ensuring that microorganisms and fish have a healthy environment to live in, which is important for fishery success in San Diego Bay. So on a regional level, these things are important. I mentioned feminization trends. Sea turtles are organisms that are not born, they lay their eggs without sex chromosomes. And so the sex of a sea turtle is determined by the temperature in which that egg is incubated. And so at 29.5 degrees Celsius, we see an even split of male and female sea turtles. And as you increase the temperature, we see a preference for female sea turtles. And as you decrease, we see a preference towards male sea turtles. And so as we continue to see warming temperatures on beaches and air temperature and sand temperature, we're seeing these really dramatic feminization trends, which I think the sea turtle populations from the research thus far can sustain a female preference, but only to a certain point. And so as we see these changes in sex ratios, there's also a threat of decreased resilience. If you have so many female sea turtles and a decrease in male sea turtles, you have a lot of inbreeding and less genetic diversity. And then on a warming sand and water temperatures, we're seeing threats to these nesting habitats. When the sand is too warm, there's also really high egg mortality rates. There is a temperature at which those eggs just no longer hatch. And then, yeah. So what would I recommend based on the research that I have done? We've seen a lot of success with shading and irrigation tactics on these nesting beaches. And so there is opportunity to, there's a lot of volunteer work where people are responsible for irrigating nests, which means making sure you have water in them to decrease their temperatures, as well as using shading, whether that's man-made structures or natural vegetation on beaches to decrease the temperature of those nests so that we have a little bit more of an equal split in our sex ratio. A big one in San Diego Bay locally is when we see boat strikes, there's not a lot of speed limit enforcement in the bay, and so that is one very easy, low-hanging fruit that we can do to protect our local turtles. And in terms of funding, I don't really have the time to get into all of this, but we are seeing a bit of a funding crisis in terms of conservation, money available to NGOs and nonprofits that work in conservation. And so California does have a Budget Stabilization Act, which is there to supplement federal funding, usually used in times of economic emergencies. But that is an option to supplement some of our even local government agencies that are struggling with their funding right now. And SR3 for sea turtles, SR3 is a marine mammal organization funded by a wealthy philanthropist and who basically took up marine mammals as his passion project. And so kind of seeking out these individuals, sea turtles are not covered under that because they're not technically marine mammals. So seeking out these individuals that are passionate about that and have the desire to fund these different organizations that are currently struggling is also an option. And I feel like this funding crisis that we're experiencing right now has given us the opportunity to close the funding gap by incentivizing the private sector. So there's a lot of hotels in San Diego Bay. There are a lot of people that have the opportunity to optimize the sea turtles that are in their backyard, whether that's through tourism. At La Jolla Shores, there's kayaking and paddleboarding and different snorkeling experiences. When you have sea turtles, that really bolsters those local businesses as well. So kind of some concluding thoughts. When I initially began this project, I was solely interested in the climate change impacts on turtle populations along our coast. And as I've conducted research and connected with different stakeholders through fieldwork, through one-on-one conversations and various stakeholder groups, I've realized that species biology and climate change are not two-dimensional. They're all deeply interconnected. And the way that the outside world understands science and the value of conservation really weighs, and the way that they weigh the threats of climate change heavily impacts our ability to make meaningful change in those areas. We have an opportunity to increase both awareness and understanding surrounding the inherent value of sea turtles in our local communities through meaningful public outreach and advocacy. Increases in the prevalence of citizen science and opportunities for youth to get involved in community science initiatives help build a strong foundation for a community that really values its natural resources and wildlife. And so what is next? Public outreach and advocacy, I just talked about a little bit. Citizen science opportunities. So I had the opportunity to work and meet with Tracy, who is a really involved member of the San Diego Bay community. She got involved with NOAA during COVID by helping them continue turtle surveys in the bay, and she goes out on her kayak every morning and does turtle sightings that she then sends into NOAA. And turtle conservation is something she's really passionate about, and she continues to advocate for. She goes to different hotel managers. She's advocating for signs in the bay to enforce these speed limits. And she's just a really awesome example of what it looks like when we have community outreach, involvement, and advocacy. Continued conservation efforts are also really important, and coming up with creative solutions to this funding gap. As much as these are challenges that we're facing right now, this also gives us an opportunity to create a more resilient economic framework on the whole. Awesome. Any questions?
Telemetry device? Oh, sorry. How long do the telemetry devices stay on the turtles, and when do they fall off? Are they reusable? Any data on that?
Yes, so they can stay on anywhere from like 6 months to 2 years. And so sea turtles really like to rub up against different like buoys and man-made structures in the bay, and so that can kind of accelerate when those things fall off. Unfortunately, they are not reusable. Every once in a while, if they happen to find one, they'll go ahead and reuse it, but sometimes it is just a bit of a lost cause.
Sorry if you already iterated this, but I was just wondering, as far as the feminization of sea turtles, how is it looking for populations right now? Is there like a percentage of, you know, how many females, and like how does that look for recovery rates at this moment?
Yeah, great question. So it does depend, it's very regional specific. And so they've done studies in the Great Barrier Reef, and they've found that even from the north and south, they've had different numbers, but on the north end of the Great Barrier Reef, they've seen up to 99% feminization trends, which is really alarming. And then even in San Diego Bay, we are already seeing an increase in feminization. I think it was previously like 4 females to every 1 male, and now we're seeing a 9-to-1 ratio. So we're definitely on the incline, but some areas are more heavily impacted than others.
how long, so when you're like, the process of getting the turtles captured and like when you have them out on land, like how long does that process take? And is it just putting on the telemetry device, or what other processes are happening?
Great question. Thank you for that. They go out repeatedly throughout the day. So the fieldwork starts around 8 a.m. and it ends around 2 p.m. And throughout the day, they are bringing in different turtles. The process of actually, you get the turtle, you make the measurements, you take skin samples, a blood sample, and then with some of them you attach these devices, some of them you attach cameras. It all takes about an hour. The turtles are okay to be outside on land for a couple hours for sure, but they make sure to put them back in the water as fast as possible.